GhastlyGarlic Episode 38. The House Across from the Graveyard, A Descent into Darkness. Chapter 1, The Graveyard's Whisper. The move to the new house felt like a fresh start, yet something about the place sent an inexplicable chill down their spines. It was a house much like any other in the Row of 14, but its location, a stone's throw from the graveyard, made it stand apart. The graveyard wasn't just any plot of land, it was ancient, filled with gravestones worn by time, their inscriptions almost unreadable. Towering ketapang trees lined the perimeter, their twisted branches like gnarled fingers scratching at the sky. The house had stood empty for years, its windows like hollow eyes staring out at the graves. Rumors swirled about why it had been abandoned, whispers of strange happenings that drove the previous occupants away. But those were just stories, the kind villagers tell to keep children in line. Or so they thought. From the very first night, the house seemed to breathe with a life of its own. The air inside was heavy, thick with a sense of foreboding. The shadows stretched longer than they should, creeping into corners where the light didn't quite reach. Even the most mundane sounds, a creak in the floorboards, the groan of the wind, took on an ominous tone. As the family settled in, the nights grew more unsettling. The graveyard, which they could see clearly from their front porch, seemed to pulse with a strange energy after dark. The shadows cast by the trees grew darker, almost solid, as if something was moving within them. The streetlights lining the path through the graveyard flickered, their light dimming until the entire area was swallowed by darkness. And then the whispers began. Late at night, when the world outside was still, they could hear it. A soft murmur, like a conversation carried on the wind. At first, they thought it was just the breeze rustling the leaves, but the voices became more distinct. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, insistent, as if something or someone was trying to get their attention. The whispers seemed to seep through the walls, curling around them as they lay in bed. A ghostly chorus that kept them from sleep. Chapter 2, The Haunting Melody. It was the third night, when the whispers turned into something more tangible. The family had gone to bed, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that had become a constant presence in the house. The mother was the first to hear it. A soft, melodic hum coming from somewhere deep within the house. She sat up in bed, straining to listen. The hum grew louder, more distinct, and she recognized it as a lullaby, an old, forgotten tune that she hadn't heard since she was a child. It was a song her mother used to sing, one that hadn't been uttered in years. But there was something off about it, a discordant note that sent shivers down her spine. The melody drifted through the house, growing louder until it filled every corner. It was beautiful and haunting, but it carried an undercurrent of something dark, something wrong. She got out of bed, her heart pounding, and followed the sound down the hallway. As she walked, the air grew colder, each step taking her deeper into a freezing chill. She reached the living room, where the sound seemed to be coming from. The room was bathed in a pale, unnatural light, the source of which she couldn't identify. The shadows on the walls seemed to move on their own, twisting and contorting in time with the music. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, stood a figure. It was barely more than a silhouette, but its presence was undeniable. The figure was tall and gaunt, its body shrouded in darkness. As the lullaby played on, the figure began to sway, as if dancing to the haunting tune. The mother froze, her breath catching in her throat. The figure's head turned slowly, its face still obscured by shadow, but she could feel its eyes on her. The lullaby grew louder, more insistent, as if urging her to step closer. She wanted to run, to wake her family and flee the house, but her feet wouldn't move. She was rooted to the spot, trapped by the eerie melody. The figure took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The shadows seemed to ripple around it, dark tendrils that reached out toward her. The temperature in the room dropped even further, her breath coming out in visible puffs of air. The figure was almost upon her now, and she could finally see its face, or what was left of it. It was the face of an old man, but it was distorted, twisted in a grotesque mockery of life. His eyes were empty sockets, his mouth a gaping hole from which the lullaby seemed to emanate. The sight was so horrifying that she wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The figure raised a hand, reaching for her, and she knew that if it touched her, she would never escape. In that moment, the lullaby stopped. The figure froze, its hand inches from her face, and the room was plunged into silence. The shadows receded, and the pale light dimmed until it was gone completely. The figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving her standing alone in the dark. She stumbled back to bed, her body shaking uncontrollably. She didn't sleep that night, her mind replaying the horrifying encounter over and over. She didn't tell her family about what she had seen, but the fear in her eyes was impossible to hide. Chapter 3: The Midnight Visitor. The nights grew darker, each one more oppressive than the last. The whispers returned, more persistent now, and with them came a sense of dread that hung over the house like a dark cloud. The family felt it constantly, a weight pressing down on their chests, making it hard to breathe. The father, determined to protect his family, began staying up late into the night, keeping watch. He sat by the window, his eyes fixed on the graveyard outside, watching for any sign of movement. But the shadows were thick, impenetrable, and no matter how hard he stared, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him back. It was on one of these nights that the knocking began. At first, it was just a single knock. A sharp rap on the front door that echoed through the house. The father jumped to his feet, his heart racing. He listened, but the knock didn't come again. He tried to convince himself that it was just the wind, but the unease in his gut told him otherwise. The next night, the knocking returned, louder and more insistent. This time, it came from the back door. 3 sharp knocks that reverberated through the house. The father grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. He threw it open, shining the light into the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the empty night and the whisper of the wind. As he turned to close the door, he heard it. A faint shuffling sound coming from the side of the house. He swung the flashlight around, the beam cutting through the darkness, but still, there was nothing. His breath came in shallow gasps, his skin prickling with fear. He slammed the door shut, locking it tight, but the knocking continued, moving from door to door, window to window, as if something was circling the house, looking for a way in. The knocking kept him up all night, relentless in its pursuit. He knew something was out there, something that wasn't going to stop until it got what it wanted. By the time dawn broke, he was exhausted, his nerves frayed, but the knocking had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence. Chapter 4: The Unseen Terror. Days turned into weeks, and the nights became a waking nightmare. The family could barely sleep, too terrified of what might happen when the sun went down. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the knocking never ceased, following them from room to room, a relentless pursuit that left them on edge. But it wasn't just the sounds that haunted them. It was the feeling, an overwhelming sense of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The air in the house grew thick, suffused with an energy that buzzed just beneath the surface, like a storm waiting to break. The children began to change. Their once bright and playful personalities dimmed, replaced by a quiet, sullen demeanor. They spoke little, their eyes hollow, as if they were carrying a burden too heavy for their young shoulders. They often complained of nightmares, terrifying visions of dark figures standing at the foot of their beds, of hands reaching out from the shadows to pull them into the darkness. One night, as the father sat by the window, keeping his nightly vigil, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was just after midnight, the hour when the house seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He had been staring at the graveyard, his eyes half closed with exhaustion, when he noticed movement among the gravestones. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then he saw it, a figure, tall and thin, emerging from the shadows of the trees. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it had all the time in the world. The father's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the figure drift toward the house, its form becoming more distinct with each step. It was the same figure his wife had seen, the old man with the empty eyes and the twisted face. But this time, it was not just an apparition. The figure was solid, its feet crunching on the gravel path as it approached the house. The father wanted to move, to run and protect his family, but he was frozen in place, his body refusing to obey his commands. The figure stopped just outside the window, its face level with the father's. It stared at him through the glass, its empty eye sockets boring into his soul. The father could feel its cold breath on his skin, a chill that seeped into his bones. The figure raised a hand, pressing it against the window, and the glass frosted over with an unnatural cold. The father tore his gaze away, breaking the spell that had held him captive. He stumbled back, his heart racing, and when he looked back, the figure was gone. The frost on the window melted, leaving behind a single handprint on the glass. Chapter 5: The Final Descent. The family knew they couldn't stay any longer. The house was no longer a home, it was a prison, a place of terror that had them trapped. But leaving was easier said than done. The force that haunted them wasn't going to let them go so easily. On their final night in the house, the whispers reached a fever pitch, filling every room with their maddening chorus. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with a sense of impending doom. The knocking returned, louder and more frantic, as if whatever was outside was growing desperate. The mother gathered the children, her heart pounding in her chest. They were going to leave, to run as far from this cursed place as they could. But as they reached the front door, it slammed shut in their faces, the locks clicking into place. The whispers grew louder, filling their ears with a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words unintelligible, but filled with malice. The father grabbed a chair, trying to break the window, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was as if the house itself was alive, determined to keep them trapped inside. The shadows on the walls began to move, swirling and twisting, forming into shapes that were almost human. And then, they appeared. The figures, 3 of them, emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting and flickering like candle flames. They were the spirits of the graveyard, the ones who had been disturbed by the family's presence, drawn to the house by some ancient, malevolent force. Their faces were twisted, their eyes empty, and they moved with an unnatural grace, floating above the ground as they approached. The mother screamed, clutching her children to her chest, but the figures continued to advance. The father stood in front of them, his body shaking with fear, but he knew there was nothing he could do to protect his family. The figures reached out, their hands like claws, and the air grew even colder, the room filled with the sound of their raspy breaths. The lights flickered, the shadows danced, and the whispers grew so loud that they drowned out all other sound. The figures closed in, their empty eyes locked on the family, and the room was plunged into darkness. In the morning, the house stood silent and empty. The door was unlocked, the windows intact, but the family was gone, vanished without a trace. The only sign that they had ever been there was the faint sound of knocking that could still be heard if you listened closely, a haunting reminder of the terror that had consumed them. The villagers spoke of the house in hushed tones, warning others to stay away, but no one dared to enter. The graveyard remained, a dark and silent sentinel, watching over the empty house as it slowly crumbled under the weight of its secrets. And at night, when the wind howled through the ketapang trees, and the shadows stretched long across the paths of the graveyard, the sound of knocking could still be heard, faint but persistent, as if the house itself was calling out, remembering the horrors it had witnessed. In the dead of night, it was easy to believe that the spirit had never truly left, that it still lingered, trapped between the worlds of the living and the dead, forever drawn to the house that faced the graveyard. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.